I've always loved hiking. There's something about getting out into the woods, away from everything, that resets my mind. No traffic, no screens, no constant noise. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the crunch of dirt under my boots. So when my old roommate and a close friend suggested a weekend hike in Tennessee, I was all in. The plan was simple. Drive out, spend a day hiking into the woods, camp overnight, then head back the next morning. A straightforward, no-stress trip. I wish it had stayed that way. We hit the trail in the early afternoon. The air was warm but not too hot, the kind of weather that made hiking comfortable. The trail was well-worn but empty. No other hikers. That was fine by me. I liked the isolation. For the first couple of hours, everything was normal. We walked at a steady pace, occasionally stopping to check our map or take a sip of water. The woods were alive with the usual sounds: birds, the distant rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the wind shifting through the trees. Then we reached the stream. It wasn't particularly wide, maybe 10 feet across, but the water was moving fast. It looked deep enough to be a hassle to wade through, so we stopped to figure out the best way across. That's when we saw them. On the other side of the stream, about 5 or 6 guys were getting ready to cross. At first, I didn't think much of it, just other hikers. But then I realized something was off. They weren't wearing clothes, just socks and shoes, nothing else. It took my brain a second to process what I was looking at. A bunch of fully grown, naked men, standing in the woods like it was the most normal thing in the world. They weren't talking, just standing there watching the water like they were waiting for something. Something about the scene felt wrong. I mean, I get it. Some people like hiking naked. It's a thing. I've heard about it before, but seeing it in person, in the middle of nowhere with no warning, felt weird. Then one of them looked at us. Not a casual glance, a direct, unblinking stare. Then the others noticed us too. None of them said a word. They just stared. We weren't sure what to do. Felt awkward as hell. The only way forward was to cross the stream, but that meant getting closer to these guys. After a few moments, they started moving. One by one, they waded into the water. The current was strong, but they moved through it slowly, carefully, never breaking eye contact. That's when I noticed something else. They weren't carrying any gear, no backpacks, no water bottles, no supplies at all, just naked bodies, moving across the stream with a strange, eerie stillness. They reached our side and stepped onto the bank, water streaming down their legs. None of them spoke. They just stood there for a moment, looking at us, then turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the trees like they had never been there at all. We waited until they were completely gone before we crossed. I kept glancing back, expecting to see them watching from the tree line, but they were gone. Still, the weirdness of the encounter stuck with me. There was something unnatural about it. Not in a supernatural way, but in a human way. Why would a group of grown men be out here without any gear, just wandering the woods completely naked? And why did they act so strange? As we moved deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, a couple of miles later, we found something that made my stomach drop. Pile of clothes, just off the trail, half hidden in the brush. A mess of shirts, pants, underwear, all crumpled together like someone had stripped them off and left them behind. They looked old, dirty, like they had been there for a while. I didn't say anything, but I could tell my friends saw it too. We all felt it, that creeping unease. Something was wrong with this place. By the time we made it to our campsite, the sun was dipping low. The air had cooled, and the forest was starting to take on that dim, shadowed look that made everything feel a little more eerie. We set up our tents, started a small fire, and tried to shake off the weirdness of the day. But that feeling didn't go away. The woods were too quiet. Normally, at night, you hear things: crickets, distant owls, the occasional rustle of some small animal moving through the underbrush. But now there was nothing, just silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why I was awake. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint embers glowing in the dark. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, close. I held my breath, listening. Footsteps, slow, careful. Something or someone was moving through our campsite. I didn't move. My heart was hammering in my chest. Then, through the thin fabric of my tent, I saw a shadow, tall, human-shaped, standing just a few feet away. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I stayed as still as possible, gripping the handle of my knife so tight my fingers hurt. Then, after what felt like forever, the shadow shifted and walked away. We packed up at first light. None of us talked about what had happened, but we all felt it. The need to get out of there. As we hiked back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. We didn't see the naked men again, but just before we reached the parking lot, we passed a sign we hadn't noticed on the way in. A small, wooden sign nailed to a tree, its paint faded with age. It had only one word on it. We never went back. I had been planning the trip for months. Just me, my truck, and the open wilderness. I had been feeling burned out, stretched thin by work and life in general, and I needed to get away. I wasn't new to solo camping. I had done it plenty of times before, and I always found it peaceful. Something about being completely alone out in nature made me feel more like myself, like I could breathe again. I picked a spot deep in the mountains, a place far from the usual campgrounds, where I wouldn't have to worry about running into noisy tourists or weekend campers with blaring music and bright lanterns. I wanted quiet. I wanted to hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees and the distant sound of a river. I had studied the maps, checked the weather, made sure I had everything I needed. I packed my truck with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, cooler, enough food and water to last a few days, plus my knife and bear spray, just in case. The drive was long, winding up through back roads that turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on my map, it was late afternoon, and I was the only person for miles. I set up camp in a clearing near the tree line, with a good view of the valley below. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was perfect. I got my fire going, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for the night, watching the flames flicker against the dark. At some point, I must have dozed off in my chair because I woke up suddenly. The fire burned low, the night completely still. No wind, no rustling in the trees, just silence. I stretched, got up, and banked the fire before climbing into my tent. The night was cool, and the ground was firm beneath my sleeping bag. As I zipped myself in, I felt that small flicker of unease, the kind that always comes when you're alone in the wild. Not fear, just the awareness that I was truly, completely by myself. I closed my eyes and forced myself to relax. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. No noise had woken me, no sudden movement, just that same strange feeling from earlier, like something was off. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of my camp. I froze. My mind immediately went through the possibilities. An animal, maybe a deer, wandering close. A bear? But the steps weren't heavy enough for that. I stayed still, heart pounding, ears straining to pick up every sound. The footsteps circled, not coming closer, not moving away, just circling. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The bear spray was within reach too, but I didn't move yet. I needed to know what I was dealing with. Then, as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, knife in hand, waiting, but nothing else happened. No more sounds, no more movement. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a light, restless sleep. Morning came, bright and crisp, as if the night before had never happened. The fire pit was undisturbed, my gear untouched, but something felt wrong. I stood and stretched, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Then I saw them, footprints, not mine, not boot prints, bare feet, pressed into the dirt around my tent, circling my camp. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. The prints were fresh. Someone had been out here walking around my camp while I slept. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement, but the woods were still. Whoever it was, they were gone now. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They were small, not child-sized, but not large either. The toes dug into the dirt, meaning whoever it was had been moving slowly, carefully. I straightened up and took a deep breath. I didn't like this. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, every movement feeling too slow, my back prickling with the feeling of being watched. I didn't stop to eat, didn't bother with breakfast. I just needed to get out of there. As I threw the last of my stuff into the truck, I took one last look at the footprints. They were leading away from my camp now, back into the trees. But there was something else. A set of them coming back. Whoever it was had left before sunrise. But before that, at some point in the night, they had stopped circling and stood right outside my tent, listening. I got in my truck and left without looking back. I don't know why I went back. I had hiked those woods before, years ago, back when I was younger and didn't know better. It was the kind of place that stayed with you, though, the kind that crept into your bones long after you left. The thick forests, the endless silence, the way the trees pressed in, heavy and watchful. It wasn't a friendly place. I had told myself I wouldn't return, but time dulls things. The older I got, the more I convinced myself that I had overreacted, that I had imagined things. So when an old buddy mentioned the cabin was still standing, deep in the woods, barely used anymore, I found myself considering it. A week alone in the mountains, away from everything. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. It didn't sound so bad. The hike in was harder than I remembered. The trail had mostly disappeared, swallowed by the undergrowth, and I had to fight through brush and deadfall to make progress. The cabin sat nearly 20 miles from the nearest road, far enough that no one just stumbled upon it. I had packed light food, water, sleeping bag, a small hatchet, and my rifle. I didn't plan to hunt, but I wasn't stupid enough to come out here unarmed. The woods had predators, both the four-legged and two-legged kind. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping low, turning the sky that deep orange that never lasts long enough. The cabin looked almost exactly as I remembered. Weathered logs, sagging roof, a small porch with a single chair. The lock on the door was rusted, but the key still fit. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and dust. The furniture was simple. An old table, a wooden chair, a narrow cot against the wall. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, blackened with years of use. A few shelves held ancient canned goods that I wouldn't be touching. It was exactly as I had left it. But as I stood there, taking it all in, that feeling crept back. The one I had forgotten, that heavy, watching silence. I shook it off. First night nerves, nothing more. The first couple of days passed quietly. I spent the daylight hours hiking the nearby trails, collecting firewood, filtering water from the small creek that ran behind the cabin. The solitude felt good, peaceful even. At night, though, the feeling returned. That sense that something wasn't right started small. On the third morning, I noticed something odd. My gear had been moved. My rifle, which I always kept propped against the cot, was leaning against the wall by the door. My pack was half-zipped, though I knew I had closed it. I tried to explain it away. Maybe I had been careless. Maybe I had moved things and forgotten. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I locked the door. The fourth night, I woke up to a sound. A slow, deliberate creak of wood. I lay still, barely breathing. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Another creak. The porch. I gripped my rifle, heart hammering. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, mountain lion, maybe a stray hunter. But no animal would step that carefully. The sound stopped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I checked the clearing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there, leading up to the porch, were footprints. Barefoot, human. The tracks circled the cabin, moving toward the door, then back into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, my skin crawling. I wasn't alone out here. I considered leaving, but I had hiked nearly 20 miles to get here. Another day's walk just to reach my truck. I told myself it was nothing. A lost hiker, maybe, someone passing through. I would stay one more night. That evening, I built a fire outside, keeping my rifle close. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. I ate quickly, my eyes scanning the treeline. As the sky darkened, I locked the cabin door and braced a chair under the handle, just in case. I lay down, but I didn't sleep. Hours passed. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A soft shuffle of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, my fingers tight around the rifle. The footsteps moved to the window. A shadow passed over the thin curtain. My chest clenched. I forced myself to stay still, to wait. Then the doorknob rattled. Not violently, just testing. I raised the rifle, my pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The rattling stopped. A long silence. Then soft footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag, my rifle slung over my shoulder. When I stepped outside, the forest was still. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy. The footprints were back, fresh. They led from the trees to the cabin. But this time, they didn't leave. I scanned the area, my stomach twisting. Whoever had been watching me was still out here. I didn't wait. I moved fast, taking the narrow trail toward my truck. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. By midday, I was making good time. The sun was high, and I started to feel the first real relief in days. Then I saw it. Ahead, just off the trail, something was hanging from a tree. A deer carcass, but not just hanging. It had been tied there, its legs bound with vines, its throat slit clean. And beneath it, on the ground, a single object. A boot. An old, rotting hiking boot. I turned and walked faster. The rest of the hike was a blur, pushing through the underbrush, barely stopping to rest. By the time I reached my truck, the sky was turning orange. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. But before I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood at the tree line, far enough to be blurry, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. Small, barefoot, watching. I didn't wait. I turned the key, slammed the truck into gear, and tore down the dirt road, not stopping, not looking back. I never told anyone what happened. I don't know who or what I saw in those woods. I just know that I won't be going back. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the mountains. Hiking alone gave me a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. No noise, no distractions. Just the sound of my boots on the dirt, the wind in the trees, and the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. This trip was supposed to be no different. A 3-day solo hike through a stretch of remote wilderness, a route I had mapped out weeks in advance. It wasn't a well-known trail, and that was the appeal. No crowded campsites, no people. just me and the land. I parked my truck at the trailhead early in the morning, my pack loaded with everything I'd need: tent, food, water, a map, a compass. The sky was a dull gray, the air cool but not cold. Perfect hiking weather. The first few hours passed easily. The trail climbed steadily, winding through thick pine forests, crossing over small creeks and rocky slopes. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. By midday, I had reached a high ridge with a view that stretched for miles. Rolling hills, dense woods, the peaks of distant mountains. I ate a quick lunch, checked my map, and kept moving. The plan was simple: follow the ridge for a while, then descend into the valley where I'd set up camp for the night. From there, I'd hike deeper into the forest, loop around the base of the mountains, and eventually make my way back. Should have been easy, but sometime in the afternoon, I realized something was wrong. The trail had started to fade. At first, it was subtle, the dirt path narrowing, the grass creeping in. Then it became worse. Fallen branches blocked the way. The ground became uneven, rocks and roots jutting up where they shouldn't have been. I checked my map again, frowning. The trail wasn't supposed to be like this. I pushed on, assuming it was just an overgrown section. Maybe fewer people had hiked this way recently. But the farther I went, the worse it got. Then, all at once, the trail was gone. I stopped, looking around. Nothing but thick trees, endless underbrush. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest. I had been following a clear path just minutes ago. There was no reason for it to just disappear. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had my compass, my map. I could backtrack if I needed to. I turned around. The trail behind me was gone, too. That didn't make sense. I had just come from there. But now it was as if the forest had swallowed it up.
No footprints.
No broken branches. No sign that anyone had passed through. A knot formed in my stomach. I pulled out my compass, the needle spinning slightly before settling. I checked the map again, tracing my route. I had been heading west. If I kept moving in that direction, I'd eventually cross a stream marked on the map. I started walking. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in closer. The ground was rough, sloping downward, forcing me to pick my steps carefully. The silence felt heavier now, as if the woods were listening. Minutes passed, then an hour.
No estream.
No trail, no sign of anything. I stopped, wiping sweat from my forehead. I had been hiking for hours. I should have reached the stream by now. I checked my compass again. The needle was pointing the wrong way. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't possible. I tapped the compass, shook it slightly. The needle wobbled, then settled, still pointing in the wrong direction. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Something was wrong. I had to get out of here. I turned sharply, deciding to head back the way I had come, even if I couldn't see the trail. I'd retrace my steps, find something familiar, but as I moved, nothing looked right. The trees all looked the same. The ground was uneven, sloping in ways that didn't match what I remembered. It felt like I was walking in circles, but I didn't stop. Then I heard it, a sound, a branch snapping. I froze. It had come from behind me. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest was silent again. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening. Another sound, a footstep, not mine. My skin crawled. I wasn't alone. I didn't move, didn't breathe. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, deep in the trees, I saw something. A shape, far away, barely visible through the branches. A figure, motionless, watching. A chill ran through me. I turned and started walking, faster this time, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. The forest blurred around me as I moved. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree. My legs ached, my throat dry, but I kept going. Minutes passed, an hour. Then I saw something ahead, a structure, a cabin. I hesitated. It was old, weathered. No smoke from a chimney.
No lights.
But it was shelter. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. The door was slightly open. Pushed it wider, peering inside. Empty. Dust covered everything. A broken chair, a rusted stove, shelves lined with old, empty cans. And something else. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh. My chest tightened. Someone had been here. Recently. I backed away, stepping off the porch. The woods were silent. Then, in the distance, I saw movement. The figure, closer now, still watching. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not when my lungs burned. Not when my legs screamed for rest. I just ran. Somehow, I found my way back to the real trail. I didn't question it. I just ran. By the time I reached my truck, it was almost dark. I threw my pack into the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there, breathing hard, staring into the trees. Nothing moved, but I knew I had been followed, and I would never know why. Alaska is beautiful, wild, and completely unforgiving. That's what drew us there in the first place. My friend Jake and I had planned this trip for nearly a year, 3 weeks of backpacking and camping through some of the most remote and untouched wilderness east of Fairbanks. No cell service, no people, just miles of dense forest, towering mountains, and icy rivers cutting through the land. We wanted a challenge, an adventure we'd never forget. We got more than we bargained for. The first week was smooth, tough, but nothing we couldn't handle. We navigated thick brush, crossed freezing rivers, and climbed steep ridges where the wind threatened to knock us over. The days were long, and the nights were cold, but we were prepared. Then, on the 9th day, the weather turned. It started as a distant rumble of thunder, low and deep, rolling over the mountains like a warning. The sky darkened fast, thick gray clouds swallowing the sunlight. The air felt different, charged, electric. We had planned to set up camp in an open clearing near a small stream, but as the wind picked up and the first drops of rain hit, we realized we didn't have time. Setting up the tent in those conditions would be a nightmare. The wind was howling through the trees, bending them at unnatural angles, and the temperature was dropping fast. That's when Jake spotted the cave. It wasn't big, just a narrow opening in the rock, partially hidden by moss and tangled brush. It wasn't deep either, maybe 15 feet back before it closed off into darkness. But it was shelter, and that's all we cared about. We crawled inside, just far enough to stay dry. The rain hit hard minutes later, sheets of it pounding the ground outside. Wind roared through the trees, branches snapped, and lightning flashed across the sky, turning the whole forest white for a split second at a time. We ate a quick, cold dinner, huddled in our sleeping bags, and let the storm rage outside. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found the cave. I had no idea what was sleeping just a few feet behind us. I slept lightly, the wind and rain making it hard to fully relax. Every so often, I'd wake up, adjust my sleeping bag, and drift off again. At some point, maybe a few hours before dawn, the storm started to ease. The wind died down, the rain slowed to a light drizzle, and the deep silence of the wilderness crept back in. I finally slept soundly. Then morning came. I woke up to the pale light of dawn filtering through the cave entrance. The air was damp, cold. I sat up, stretched, and turned toward the opening. That's when I saw it. Less than 10 feet away, just inside the mouth of the cave, was a bear. A massive grizzly, curled up, breathing slow and heavy in deep sleep. My brain refused to process it at first. For a long, frozen second, I just stared. Its fur was thick and matted, dark brown with patches of lighter gold. Its massive paws twitched slightly as it slept, its claws long and curved like knives. I could hear its breathing, deep, steady, almost rhythmic. the kind of sleep that nothing should have been able to disturb. Jake was still asleep next to me. I didn't dare move to wake him. I could feel my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, a cold sweat breaking out along my spine. If the bear woke up, we were dead. I had to get out. I moved painfully slow, every motion calculated, my breathing shallow and quiet. I reached for my pack, careful not to make a sound. Every tiny noise felt deafening. The cave floor was uneven, littered with small rocks. My boots scraped against one, and my heart stopped. The bear shifted slightly, not awake, not yet. I swallowed hard, forcing my hands to stay steady. I slid my pack on inch by inch. Every second stretched, my muscles screaming at me to move faster, but I couldn't risk it. I got to my knees. Slowly, painfully slowly, I started crawling toward the entrance. The bear exhaled, a deep, rumbling sigh. I froze. It didn't wake up. I kept moving. The light from outside grew brighter. The fresh air felt like salvation. I crawled forward, my legs stiff and shaking. Then I was outside. I didn't stop. I got to my feet and walked, slow, steady, deliberate steps, until I was at least 50 yards away. Then I turned. Jake was still in there. I barely breathed as I watched the cave entrance, my mind racing. How the hell was I supposed to wake him up without waking the bear? Then movement. Jake's head appeared in the entrance. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He had seen it. He moved exactly like I had, slow, controlled. No sudden movements, no noise. I watched him inch out of the cave, my hands clenched into fists. The bear didn't wake up. Jake took his first step outside, then another. As soon as he was clear, we locked eyes, and then we ran. We didn't stop running for nearly half a mile. Through thick brush, over rocks, leaping fallen logs like our lives depended on it, because they did. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we looked back. Nothing. The bear hadn't followed us. It had never woken up. We stood there, bent over, hands on our knees, trying to process what had just happened. If the storm hadn't hit, if we had set up our tent like we planned, if we had slept just a little further back in the cave. I don't like thinking about those ifs. We changed our route after that, putting as much distance as possible between us and that cave. The rest of the trip was tough, but nothing compared to that morning. By the time we made it back to civilization, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. But it wasn't, and I don't think I'll ever sleep in a cave again. Hiking alone has never scared me. If anything, I've always preferred it. I like the quiet, the steady rhythm of my footsteps on dirt, the way the trees close in around me like a shelter. There's something calming about being so far from everything. That's why I chose this trail. It wasn't a marked path, just something I found on an old hiking forum, an unofficial route deep in the backcountry, mostly known to experienced hikers. No crowds, no families with kids, no paved walkways or wooden signs pointing you toward a gift shop. Just raw wilderness. That's exactly what I wanted. I drove out early, before the sun was up, my car loaded with the usual gear, enough food and water for a long day's hike, a compass, a map, a flashlight with extra batteries. I wasn't planning to camp, but I still packed a lightweight sleeping bag just in case. I'd learned over the years that it's always better to be over-prepared than under. The drive was long, winding up narrow roads that cut through thick forest. The trailhead was nothing more than a break in the trees, barely noticeable from the road. No parking lot, no sign, just a gap in the undergrowth where the path started. I pulled over, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The forest smelled damp, like recent rain, and the only sounds were the distant chirps of birds waking up. I shouldered my pack, double-checked my gear, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The path was faint but still visible, winding through dense trees and rocky terrain. I followed it without much trouble, moving steadily, enjoying the solitude. Then, about 3 miles in, the path split. That wasn't on the map. I stopped, looking back and forth between the two routes. One veered right, climbing slightly uphill. The other sloped downward, disappearing into thicker trees. Neither looked more well-traveled than the other. I checked my map again, but there was no mention of a fork here, just a single path leading deeper into the woods. I hesitated. I'd been hiking long enough to trust my instincts, and something about the left path, downhill, dark, overgrown, felt wrong. It didn't feel like a real trail, more like something made by animals or by people who didn't want to be found. I took the right path. It was steeper than I expected, climbing sharply before leveling out along a ridge. The trees thinned slightly, giving me a partial view of the valley below. I kept moving, my boots crunching over loose dirt and dry leaves. That's when I saw it. A single boot print, pressed deep into the trail ahead. It was fresh. That shouldn't have been strange. This was still a trail, even if it wasn't official. Other hikers could have come through recently, but something about it unsettled me. The depth of it. Whoever left it was carrying something heavy. I stepped over it and kept going. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees closing in again. The air felt thicker here, quieter. No birds, no wind, just my own footsteps. Then I found the second print. This one was different. It was deeper on one side, like the person had stumbled or been dragged. I swallowed hard. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe someone had slipped. Maybe they were carrying a heavy pack. There were 100 explanations that weren't bad. Still, I kept moving. The trail got rougher, more overgrown. It felt like I was walking a path that hadn't been used in years, not one that had fresh prints on it. Then I found the backpack. It was sitting just off the trail, half covered by leaves. The fabric was torn in places, faded from sun and rain. I crouched beside it, hesitating before I unzipped it. Empty. No food, no water, no gear. Just an old, crumpled-up map shoved into one of the side pockets. I pulled it out. It wasn't the same as mine. Vit was hand-drawn, sketched in rough lines with notes scribbled in the margins. Markings where trails should be, places crossed out, arrows pointing toward a name. Elliot Carter. I stared at it. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered. A news article months ago. A hiker had gone missing in these woods. Never found. His name was Elliot Carter. My stomach dropped. I stood up fast, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just forest. Just silence. I stuffed the map into my pocket and started moving. Faster now. I needed to turn back. I walked for what felt like hours, but the trail never looked familiar. The terrain had changed, the landmarks different. I should have reached the fork by now, but the path just kept going, winding deeper into the trees. Then I saw something ahead. Not the trailhead, not my car, a structure. It was small, half hidden by the undergrowth. A hunting cabin, maybe, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a cage, not for animals, for people. The bars were rusted, the door hanging open. A chain was looped through the latch, broken apart. Inside, something lay on the dirt floor. Not a body, just bones. Scattered, old, picked clean. I took a step back. The forest felt too quiet. Then I heard movement. Not close, but not far enough. Footsteps, deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned and ran. I ran without thinking, without looking back. I crashed through the undergrowth, my breath ragged, my legs burning. I didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't care where I was going until suddenly I was on the road. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for air. My car was right there. I didn't question it. I got in, started the engine, and drove. Fast. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles away. When I finally pulled over, hands shaking, I pulled the crumpled map from my pocket. I stared at the name written on it. Then I looked up the news article again. Elliot Carter had vanished last summer. A search party had scoured the area for weeks. They had never found him. I thought about the bones, the broken chain, and I knew someone else had. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I was just tired of the noise of everyday life. Or maybe I was just being stupid. Either way, when my friend Matt told me about his uncle's cabin and how he needed someone to watch over it for a week, I said yes. The idea of being alone in the woods didn't scare me at first. I'd gone camping before, spent nights outdoors, and I figured a week away from work and distractions would be good for me. No emails, no meetings, no people. Just me, a few books, and the sound of nature. But the moment I turned onto that dirt road leading to the cabin, something felt off. The trees pressed in too close. The road was barely wide enough for my car. The sun was starting to set, and the light filtering through the trees cast long shadows that made everything look stretched and distorted. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place getting to me. I kept driving. After a few more miles, the cabin came into view. It was smaller than I expected, just a simple wooden structure with a sagging porch and a single window on the front. There was no other house for miles. No cell service either. My bars had disappeared almost an hour ago. I parked, got out and stretched. The air was cool, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. The silence was absolute. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no planes overhead, just trees. I grabbed my bag and headed up to the porch. The key was right where Matt said it would be, under a loose board near the door. The lock was stiff, the door heavier than it looked, but it creaked open after a few tries. Inside, the air was stale, like no one had been there in a while. The cabin was one large room, bed in the corner, small kitchenette, a wooden table with 2 chairs. There was a fireplace, a few oil lamps on the shelves, and a single door leading to what I assumed was the bathroom. It wasn't cozy, but it was enough. I set my bag down, checked the supplies Matt had left: canned food, bottled water, a flashlight with extra batteries. There was no electricity, just an old propane stove for cooking and a pile of firewood stacked against the wall. I lit a fire, made some soup, and ate in silence. Outside, the trees swayed slightly in the wind. I tried to let the quiet relax me, but it didn't. Felt wrong, like the forest was watching. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dull red glow. Then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate crunch outside. Footsteps. I held my breath. The sound moved, circling the cabin. Slow, careful, not an animal. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The only weapon I had was a hunting knife Matt had left in one of the kitchen drawers. Another step, closer now. Then it stopped. I strained my ears, waiting. Nothing, just silence. After what felt like an eternity, I let out a slow breath. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind shifting the leaves. I told myself that over and over, but I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came and everything looked normal.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been out there. I told myself I had overreacted. I spent the day keeping busy, chopping wood, checking the nearby stream for fresh water, trying to enjoy the solitude. But the feeling never left. The sense that I wasn't alone. That night, I locked the door, bolted the windows, kept the knife within reach. It didn't help. The knocking started just past midnight. Soft, slow. Knock, knock, knock. Not at the door, at the window. I froze, my breath stuck in my throat. The window had no curtains, no way to block out whatever was outside. I didn't move. The knocking came again. I forced myself to look. Nothing, just the darkness pressing against the glass. I sat in bed, gripping the knife, waiting. The knocking never came again, but I didn't sleep. I woke up exhausted, every muscle tense. I stepped outside, scanning the ground, and then I saw them. Footprints.
Bora.
Human, circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been out there, watching me. I packed my things in under 10 minutes. I grabbed my keys, threw open the car door. The engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood. The battery cables were gone. Not loose. Gone. A sound behind me, a soft rustling in the trees. I turned, scanning the forest. Nothing. But I knew someone was there, watching, waiting. I grabbed the knife and backed toward the cabin. If I couldn't leave, I needed to survive the night. I barricaded the door, stacked furniture against it, kept the knife in my hand. The knocking started at midnight, not just at the window this time. The walls, the door, soft, deliberate taps, like they were playing with me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the doorknob turned. Slow. Testing. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. The sound stopped. Silence. Then footsteps. Leaving. Circling. Fading into the woods. I didn't sleep. Didn't move. Just waited for morning. First light, I ran. I didn't pack. Didn't look back. Just sprinted down the dirt road, heart hammering. I ran for almost an hour before I saw another car. An older man driving a pickup. He slowed when he saw me, eyes wide. I must have looked insane. He drove me to the nearest town. I called Matt, told him everything. He didn't sound surprised. Yeah, he said after a long pause. My uncle stopped going up there too. I never asked why. I didn't want to know. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, when everything is too quiet, I swear I still hear knocking. Camping had always been something I enjoyed, but I had never done it alone before. It was one of those things I had always told myself I'd get around to, but I never made it happen. Maybe I was just making excuses, or maybe I was avoiding the silence that came with being alone in the woods. Either way, when the opportunity finally came, I decided to take it. I picked a remote spot deep in a national forest, miles from the nearest road. No campsites, no trails, just a place I had marked on a map from a hike years ago. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving river, surrounded by thick trees. It seemed perfect. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, plenty of water, a good knife, and a first aid kit. I also brought my old bolt-action rifle, more out of habit than necessity. I wasn't worried about animals, but having it made me feel a little safer. The drive out took most of the morning. The last stretch was on a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I reached the point where I'd have to hike in, the sun was already high. I grabbed my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trees were thick, but the air was cool, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. It felt good to be away from everything, disconnected. No service, no people, just me and the woods. As I got closer to the clearing, the forest changed. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker. The air felt heavier. I had been here before, but something about it felt different this time. I reached the clearing by late afternoon. It was just as I remembered. A flat patch of earth surrounded by towering trees, the river just beyond. I set up my tent near the tree line, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, listening to the sounds of the woods. It was peaceful. Then, Just as the last bit of sunlight faded, I heard something. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice. A rustling in the trees behind me. I turned, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, but something about it felt off. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the trees. I sat there for a while, staring into the darkness, listening. Eventually, the sound stopped. I stayed up longer than I planned, keeping the fire burning, but the woods stayed silent. Finally, I crawled into my tent, zipped myself inside, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. The tent was pitch black, the only sound my own breathing. Then I heard it again. The same rustling, closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I held my breath. Then silence. I gripped the knife I had tucked in my sleeping bag, every muscle locked in place. I listened, heart pounding. The sound didn't come back. I forced myself to stay awake for a while, but eventually, exhaustion won. By morning, the fear from the night before felt distant, almost like a dream. The clearing looked the same, the river still flowed, the air was still. Then I saw them, footprints, not mine. They circled my tent, stopping just outside before vanishing into the woods. A cold wave washed over me. Someone had been here, watching. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had planned to stay another night. Maybe it had just been another hiker passing through. Maybe they didn't even know I was here. But why walk so close? Why stop at my tent? The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time the wind moved the branches, every time I heard the rustle of leaves, my heart jumped. I spent most of the afternoon gathering wood, trying to stay busy, but the unease never left. That night, I made sure the fire was big. I sat close to it, staring into the darkness, listening. Then, just past midnight, I saw it. A shape, barely visible between the trees. I froze, gripping my knife. It didn't move. I stared at it for what felt like hours. Then slowly it shifted. A step back, then another. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep. I stayed in my tent, heart pounding, knife in hand, waiting. The footsteps came again, circling, stopping. A slow exhale just outside the tent. I stopped breathing. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe hours. When the first light of dawn touched the tent, I forced myself to move. I unzipped the flap, stepping out. The fire was nothing but embers. The air was cold, and the footprints were back. This time, there were more of them, circling the campsite, stopping by my tent, then leading back into the woods. I packed fast, shoving everything into my bag, hands shaking. Every second I spent there felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The hike back felt longer. The woods felt darker. Every snap of a twig sent a jolt through my body. Halfway to my truck, the smell hit me, rotten, like meat left out too long. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I just kept walking. By the time I reached my truck, I was drenched in sweat. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I started the engine. Then I looked up, and I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, still, watching. I didn't stick around. I tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on paved roads, the forest shrinking in my mirrors. I don't know who was out there, and I don't want to know, but I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again. I don't usually get scared in the woods. I've hiked alone for years. There's a peace in being out there, far from everything. No noise but the wind in the trees and the crunch of dirt under your boots. But something changed on my last hike. I don't know how to explain it. Something was out there with me, and I don't think I was ever supposed to leave. I picked a trail that wasn't well known. It was deep in the Olympic National Forest, an old, overgrown path that I had only ever seen on satellite images. It wasn't marked, but I could see where it should be. The remains of an old logging road, winding deep into the forest, far from any campsites or other hikers. Perfect. I wanted isolation. I didn't want to see another person for miles. I got what I wanted, and more. The hike started easy. The trail was narrow, mostly just an old dirt path where trucks had once driven. The deeper I went, the more the trees closed in, thick and dark. By afternoon, I had walked about 10 miles. No signs of people, no sounds except for birds and wind. Exactly what I wanted. I found a clearing near a small creek and set up my tent. Cooked a quick meal, sat by the fire. It was peaceful, until the sound started. It was late. I had just zipped myself into my tent when I heard it. A single footstep, close, not an animal, not the wind, something heavy, deliberate. I held my breath and listened. Silence. I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe a branch falling, maybe a deer moving through the trees. I forced myself to sleep, but in the morning when I stepped outside, there were footprints, not mine, fresh, leading around my tent, and then back into the woods. I should have left. I should have packed up my gear and turned back, but I didn't. I had planned for a 3-day hike, and I wasn't going to let one bad night ruin it. So I kept going. The deeper I went, the less the trail looked like a trail. The trees grew tighter, the brush thicker, the air felt wrong, and then I found the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map. It just appeared. An old, rotting cabin, half hidden in the trees. The roof sagged. The windows were just empty holes, black and open. It looked abandoned, but the door was open, like someone had just stepped outside, like they were still close by. I didn't go in. I didn't even step closer. I just stood there, staring at it, feeling that deep, awful wrongness settle into my stomach. I turned back toward the trail, and that's when I saw the man. He was standing in the trees, far enough that I couldn't see his face, just a shape, still, silent, watching. I pretended not to see him. I turned, walked fast, didn't run. Running makes you pray. I don't know how long I walked before I stopped, but when I did, he was gone. Or maybe he was just hiding better. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't set up my tent. I just sat with my back against a tree, my knife in my hand, and waited. The forest was too quiet. No insects, no wind. Then a snap, closer than before. A single footstep, then another, slow, deliberate, circling me. I didn't breathe, didn't move, and then silence. I waited until the first hint of daylight before I stood up, and that's when I saw it. A knife stuck into a tree, right where I had been sitting. A warning, or a promise. I ran. Didn't check my GPS, didn't check the map. I just ran. Branches tore at my arms. My legs burned. I kept expecting to see him, to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing, just the woods. And then, a road, an old, cracked logging road, overgrown with weeds, and a truck, a ranger's truck. I ran straight into the road, waving my arms. The ranger hit the brakes. His window rolled down, and his face went pale when he saw me. I must have looked half dead. He didn't ask questions. He just let me in. I told them everything. They searched the area. They found my campsite. They found the footprints. But they never found him. No cabin. No knife in the tree. No sign that anyone else had been there at all. But I know what I saw, and I know deep in my gut, he's still out there, waiting for the next hiker, waiting for someone else to make a wrong turn. I had planned the trip for months, a solo hike through the Cascade Mountains, deep into the wilderness, miles away from any sign of civilization. The route I mapped out would take me through thick forests, across ridges, and down into valleys few people ever saw. It was exactly what I wanted. Complete solitude, surrounded by nature, nothing but my own strength and skill to keep me going. I packed everything carefully. My backpack was heavy with food, water, gear, and emergency supplies. My boots were broken in, my layers planned for the unpredictable mountain weather. I even had a satellite beacon in case something went seriously wrong. I had done solo trips before, but nothing this remote, nothing this demanding. This was the real test. The first day was perfect. The trail was steep, but my legs were fresh, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. The sun broke through the trees in golden beams, lighting up the moss-covered ground. I followed the trail up into the hills, climbing higher, leaving behind the last signs of human activity. By midday, I had reached the ridgeline, a narrow path cutting along the mountain with steep drop-offs on either side. The view stretched for miles, endless forested slopes rolling toward the horizon, untouched, wild. That night, I set up camp by a small alpine lake. The water was so clear I could see the smooth stones at the bottom. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl. I ate, stretched out in my sleeping bag, and felt completely at peace. The second day, I pushed deeper. The trail became rougher, barely more than an old game path in some places. I had to watch my footing constantly, stepping over exposed roots, loose rocks, patches of mud. I kept moving, pacing myself, drinking water, eating small handfuls of nuts and dried fruit to keep my energy up. I crossed a narrow stream around midday and decided to refill my water bottles. As I crouched by the bank, filtering the cold, clear water, I noticed something strange, a footprint in the mud. It was fresh, the edges still crisp. Not an animal print, a human boot. That didn't make sense. I had followed a rarely used route, far from any maintained trails. The last sign of people I had seen was miles back. Maybe someone had passed through before me, but the print looked too fresh, made within the last few hours. I scanned the area. Nothing, just trees and undergrowth, silent and undisturbed. No sounds of movement, no other tracks nearby. I kept going. Maybe another hiker had the same idea as me, taking this off-trail route. It was strange, but not impossible. I hiked for hours, climbing over fallen logs, pushing through dense brush, my legs burning with effort. By late afternoon, I reached a narrow valley with steep rock walls on either side. The air was cooler here, the sun already disappearing behind the cliffs. The map showed a faint trail cutting through, leading up the other side toward another ridge. I followed it, moving carefully over loose scree and sharp rocks. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A backpack, torn open, lying against the base of the cliff. It was old, sun-bleached, the fabric shredded as if animals had gotten to it. But it hadn't been there long. There was no moss, no dirt buildup. It looked like it had been abandoned months ago, maybe a year at most. I nudged it with my boot. Empty. No supplies, no ID, nothing to say who it belonged to. My mind raced. Had someone gotten hurt here? Had they fallen? I scanned the cliffside, but there was no sign of bones, no remnants of clothing caught on the rocks. I checked my map again. I was miles from any known campsite. This place wasn't on any official trails. The light was fading fast. I needed to find a place to camp before dark. I hiked another mile up the valley and found a flat spot beneath a rocky overhang. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something outside the tent. Every sound, the wind shifting through the trees, the rustle of leaves, felt wrong, too close, too deliberate. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, careful, stopping just beyond the thin fabric wall. I held my breath. Nothing. I waited, listening, my muscles tensed. Still nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation getting to me, but I kept my knife close, gripping it tight until my fingers ached. By dawn, I was already packed and moving. I didn't want to stay there any longer than I had to. The trail climbed sharply, taking me up and out of the valley. My legs burned, my pack felt heavier than before. The silence pressed down on me.
No birds, no insects.
Just the sound of my own breathing, my own footsteps crunching over dirt and stone. Then I saw it. Another footprint, fresh, and this time it wasn't mine. I stared at it, my skin prickling. Someone else was out here, someone moving in the same direction as me. I kept hiking faster now, pushing myself. I wanted to be out of this area, back on a real trail, anywhere but here. My lungs burned, my pulse hammered in my ears. Then, ahead on the trail, something moved. A shape half hidden by the trees. Tall, human. I froze. The figure stood there, just beyond the edge of the trail, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then it stepped back, vanishing into the trees. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I ran until my legs nearly gave out, until I reached the next ridgeline, where the terrain was too open for anyone to follow me unseen. I kept going, pushing through exhaustion, fear, everything screaming at me to get out. By nightfall, I found a spot far from the trail, hidden between boulders. I barely slept, my knife in my hand, every nerve on edge. The next morning, I moved fast. I hiked for hours, barely stopping, drinking water as I walked, ignoring the pain in my feet. By late afternoon, I reached a marked trail, a real official trail. I had never felt so relieved. I followed it all the way down, my heart pounding with every step. When I finally saw the parking lot, my car sitting exactly where I left it, I almost collapsed. I never found out who was out there. No missing persons reports, no news of lost hikers. Nothing, just footprints in the dirt, and the feeling that somewhere in those mountains, someone was still watching.